Yes, this may be the most important study ever conducted of American gun owners. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, constitutional attorney, best-selling author, and proud American gun owner. If you haven't already done so, please show your support for the Second Amendment by subscribing to this channel. Today I have huge news about a major study by a Georgetown professor who has a degree from Oxford University. His name is Bill English, and he has just reported the final results of the largest, most comprehensive survey ever done on American gun owners. And what did he learn after surveying almost 17,000? I repeat, that's 17,000 American gun owners. He learned some really huge facts in favor of gun owners and the Second Amendment. Well, it would appear, based on this survey by Professor English, that Americans have a much different view of guns than the anti-gunners do. Because the anti-gunners, of course, always just think the same old thing, which is
guns are not the answer.
But the reality is Americans overwhelmingly support their right to own and keep and use firearms for self-defense. How do we know this? Well, we know this by, among other things, this most comprehensive study that's ever been conducted of American gun owners by Professor English of Georgetown University. Now, his study, which he conducted in 2021, was just recently updated. And I'm going to put a link to the most recent version of his survey and study down below. Now, this should get huge attention in the press because, trust me, this is a big deal. It's going to be a big deal, I think, for courts. It's going to be a big deal for media. It's going to be a big deal for those in support of the Second Amendment and gun owners based on what the survey shows. But of course, because Professor English's conclusions, as I see it, are not favorable to the anti-gun narrative, I think they're going to, his study is going to get a good leaving alone by the mainstream media because, well, generally speaking, they don't like guns. So let's talk about the 5 major conclusions of Professor English's survey. The first major finding by Professor English is the incredible number of times that Americans have used firearms in defense of themselves and others. They have used, this is based on the survey results, there's approximately 1.67 million instances of self-defense with firearms every year. Now, what's interesting, and as I found it, is that the vast majority of these instances of the 1.67 million instances of self-defense using a firearm every year is the vast majority of these instances do not involve shooting the gun. They usually involve, according to the survey, either the threatening with a gun, saying you have a gun, or the brandishing of a gun. Shots are just not fired. Just by representing or showing that you have a firearm and are willing to use it in self-defense appears to be enough to basically dissipate or eliminate the threat, which is great. Now, it turns out, of course, that handguns are the most common firearms employed by Americans for self-defense. They were used in approximately 66% of the defensive instances that Professor English surveyed. And what's interesting, again, as I mentioned before, in most of these defensive instances, approximately 82% of the time, no shot was fired. Now, what's also interesting about self-defense here is that about 25% of these instances of self-defense occurred in the gun owner's home, and approximately half occurred outside of the home, but on their property. And about 1 out of 10 of these defensive gun uses occurred in public. Bottom line is this, that this shows that Americans do in fact use firearms for self-defense, approximately 1.67 million times every year. Now, the second major finding by the survey by Professor English out of Georgetown is the large number of AR-15 owners in the United States. According to the survey, approximately 30% of gun owners, which is about 24.6 million individuals, I repeat, that's a big number, 24.6 million individuals in the United States have owned an AR-15 or a similarly styled rifle. Again, keep in mind that we generally believe that right now there's about 44 million AR-15 style rifles in the United States. That's approximately what we can tell as best as we can judge. Now, I want to remind you of some other video that I've done before on the Supreme Court case of Caetano versus Massachusetts, because this is going to put this 24.6 million individuals with an AR-15 style rifle into some perspective. In the Supreme Court's case in 2016 of Caetano versus Massachusetts, they protected stun guns as a protected arm under the Second Amendment's right to keep and bear arms. Now, in the concurrence in that Caetano case, Justice Alito points out that there's only approximately 200,000 stun guns in the United States by civilians. And yet that was enough to show that stun guns were commonly possessed for lawful purposes and thus are protected arms under the Second Amendment. So if stun guns are protected with that kind of number, what do you think 24.6 million individuals possessing AR-15s? And by the way, you know and I know that number's deflated, right? You know that if you allowed more Americans the ability to have AR-style 15s in place, AR-15 style rifles in places like New York and California and Maryland, right? Places like this where you actually would just enforce the Constitution and did not have all these sort of rules and restrictions and concerns and threats and whatnot from the government on the issue of possessing these firearms, you actually, I suspect, would have a lot more individuals owning these firearms and a lot more of these AR-15 style firearms in the United States than you have right now. But either way, you certainly have far more. The third major finding by Professor English in his survey shows that the overall rate of adult firearm ownership in the United States is about 32%. This suggests that there are in excess of 81 million Americans aged 18 and over that own firearms. The average gun owner owns about 5 firearms, and handguns are, of course, the most common type of firearm owned. Makes sense. Now, again, I want to remind you, in my view, that this 81 million number of Americans is probably somewhat of an underestimate of what would occur if you actually made it more readily available to own firearms in some of the anti-gun states, like again, New York and California. I'm sure there's a lot, New Jersey, of course. I certainly, know individuals that would like to own a firearm, but they're unwilling to go through the massive paperwork headaches and the delays and all that to acquire firearms in these sort of terrible gun states. So if the Supreme Court starts enforcing the Second Amendment more robustly, I think you'll see that number of Americans owning firearms, grow dramatically above the 81 million that Professor English's survey indicates. Another interesting thing about the survey is that a majority of gun owners, that's about 56% according to Professor English's survey, have indicated that they carry a handgun for self-defense, at least in some circumstances. And about 35% of those gun owners report carrying a handgun with some frequency. In fact, according to the estimate in the survey, it appears that there's over 20 million gun owners in the United States who carry a handgun in public under some form of a concealed carry regime. And I'm guessing, again, that number could increase dramatically if the Supreme Court says that you have the right to keep and bear arms under the Second Amendment, meaning you have the right to carry guns outside the home in public for self-defense. That's going to make a big difference in those 6 to 8 may-issue jurisdictions like New Jersey, New York, California, and the like. And that's what the Supreme Court's going to hopefully address in our favor, in favor of gun owners, in the NYSERPA versus Bruin case. The fourth major conclusion, as I see it from reviewing the study, which of course I'm going to link to down below, involves standard capacity magazines, or as the anti-gunners like to call them, large capacity magazines or high capacity magazines, which of course are propaganda terms and they have no meaning and they're all made up. But it turns out, and this to me is extremely important for the fight over magazines in the United States, whether or not you can ban them in these jurisdictions that do so, or at least restrict them. 48% of gun owners, that's about 39 million individuals. Understand this, 39 million individuals have owned magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. I want to pause and think about this for a second. 39 million individuals have owned magazines that hold over 10 rounds. Not magazines that hold over 10 rounds. And the reason why I think he probably picked 10 rounds is because a lot of these jurisdictions that restrict or ban so-called standard capacity magazines that hold more than 10 rounds, 10 rounds is the general limit. Now, what's interesting is that according to Professor English's survey, he calculates that there's up to 542 million magazines that hold more than 10 rounds in the United States. I want to repeat that number because it's just an incredible number, although I completely believe it because I know if you own a semi-automatic rifle or a semi-automatic pistol, you're going to have a multitude of magazines that go along with it. So you get multiple magazines, most of which have more than 10 rounds, unless you're one of the bad jurisdictions, for your basic semi-automatic pistols and your semi-automatic AR-15 style rifles. Again, Professor English's survey shows that there are up to 542 million magazines that hold more than 10 rounds in the United States. Now think about that. That is 500 million. I repeat, that's 1/2 of a billion magazines in the United States that have a capacity of more than 10 rounds. I don't know how that's not commonly possessed arms under the Supreme Court standard. I guess we'll find out. But it certainly seems to me, based on that number, that the Supreme Court would be hard-pressed if they hear a case involving magazine restrictions or magazine bans to say that magazines that hold more than 10 rounds are not commonly possessed by Americans for lawful purposes. The fifth and final sort of category of findings by Professor English's survey that I think is worth getting into is to show the large number of minorities that have been buying firearms, including AR-15s, in recent years. As it turns out from the survey, and we know this already, that gun owners are actually quite diverse demographically. 42% are female, 58% approximately are male. Approximately 25% of African Americans own firearms in the United States, and 28% of Hispanics own firearms in the United States. 19% of Asians own firearms, and 34% of American whites own firearms. In total, Americans own over 415 million firearms, consisting of approximately 171 million handguns and 146 million rifles and 98 million shotguns. This is all based on the survey evidence that was put together by Professor English from Georgetown. And again, that study is down below in the links here. I urge you to check it out, talk about it. Remember some of this data that I'm bringing to your attention. I think it's very important, not just for the public debate about firearms, but also ultimately for these court battles involving the right to keep and bear arms. Okay, well, I hope you learned something here today at the Four Boxes Diner. Please subscribe if you haven't done so. And again, we'll see you soon here at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.